the Centre for Strategic Studies here at Victoria University of Wellington on behalf of the Centre and also the Wellington Branch of the Institute of International Affairs and its Chair, Angus Middleton. It's my very great pleasure to welcome you to tonight's event, Autonomy and Arms, Navigating the Future of Military Technology, with our very special guest, Dr. Julia Macdonald. And it's great to see you all here. It's great to have almost a full house here in the kind of villain's lair at the top of Rutherford House. This really lovely, spectacular outlook. And can I also offer a very warm welcome to the large number of people who are joining us online this evening. Hopefully there'll be a chance for those people, as well as for you here in person, to ask some questions of our speaker. I don't know about you, but it sometimes feels today that military technology is evolving in two seemingly opposite directions. On the one hand, advanced military weapon systems are becoming more complex and more expensive. And if you want an example of just how expensive some of those are, you can check the Beehive website and see the price of 5 military helicopters as announced this afternoon. Nations are investing in next generation stealth fighters, hypersonic missiles, advanced cyber warfare capabilities, AI-driven surveillance platforms. And all of that's happening. And at the same time, it also feels that we're seeing the spread of cheap, really accessible technologies, especially cheap semi-autonomous drones, and those have transformed contemporary conflict. Conflicts in places as distinct as Ukraine, Armenia, Gaza have shown how drones that just cost perhaps a few $100s or a few $1,000s a piece can destroy multi-million-dollar tanks or advanced long-range bombers, or threaten naval vessels or disrupt complex supply chains and critical logistics. But I think one point where perhaps these two opposing trends intersect is a growing interest in autonomy, or at least its potential. The convergence of high-end autonomous innovation and low-cost autonomous disruption is reshaping the battlefield, forcing militaries to rethink strategy, to adapt their defences, and to also prepare, I guess, for an era where autonomy drives technological asymmetry. Now, to help us understand this evolution of an era of unmanned or uncrewed weapons and vessels, and increasingly autonomous weapons, and to shine a light on what I think we'll see tonight is actually something that's taken place over a fairly long period of time. But yet also to understand what's really rapidly changing in the here and now. It's a real pleasure to welcome this evening Dr. Julia Macdonald. Now, Julia, I'm sure, is very well known to many people in this room in her role as Director of Research and Engagement at the Asia New Zealand Foundation. But before returning to New Zealand in 2019, she held a position as a professor in the Corbell School of International Studies at the University of Denver, and she retains an affiliation as a research professor at the University of Denver. Julia has a PhD from the George Washington University in Washington, DC, and a Master of Arts with honours from the very great University of Chicago. She's held research fellowships at MIT, at Harvard, at the University of Pennsylvania, and I'm personally very glad that she also has on her CV that she is a Senior Fellow of the Centre for Strategic Studies at Victoria University of Wellington. Julia is the author of a large body of scholarly work, but the thing that brings us here tonight is one of her most recent pieces, which is this fantastic book that she co-authored with Jacqueline Snyder. You can see it's been well thumbed. The Hand Behind Unmanned, The Origins of the US Autonomous Arsenal, and that will be the beginning, I think, of our conversation this evening. Just a little bit on format before we kick off. I'm going to ask Julia a handful of questions. We'll try and make this a kind of moderated conversation, and then we'll open it up to questions from the floor. So please think of your questions that you'd like to put to Julia before we do. So look, welcome everybody, and Julia, first of all, congratulations on the book. It's a fantastic book. It's a really stimulating read. It's a book about weapons, but it's not really a book about weapons. It's really a book about ideas, identity, and institutional culture. So let's maybe start with the book and start with the origins. It's always interesting to hear from an author. But what brought you to this topic? What are the origins of this particular piece of writing?
Thank you, David. Thank you, Angus, for organising the event today. Thank you all for being here. It's rescheduled, so I appreciate those of you who have stuck with the scheduling and turned up this evening. It's a great pleasure to see you all. So the book, it looks like quite a niche book for, a New Zealand audience. So how did this come to be? My co-author and I, Jacqueline, we met in 2012 in the United States. We were actually at an academic military boot camp, for what it's worth, where you go up into the hinterlands of Cornell University and study military strategy for 2 weeks. And in the course of those 2 weeks, we were struck by the increasing array of drone strikes that were taking place in the United States. At this time, you put yourselves back, remember you're in the middle of the global war on terror. There was an uptick, especially in drone strikes in the Bush and then Obama administrations. And in the news in the United States, many media stories about the predators, the reapers, the global hawks that were dominating the battlefields at that time. And there was a sort of inevitability around the narrative of unmanned technologies. This was the wave of the future. You sort of get on board or you get off, that the UAVs were bound to be the future. And we thought, well, if you look at the history of unmanned technologies, there's actually a wide array of sort of unmanned technologies across domains, land, sea, air, types of technologies within those domains, types of missions. And so we started wondering, why is it that you only have sort of the dominance of the predators, the reapers, the global hawks at this point in time? So what has led us to this point? What decisions were made to lead to massive investments in this one platform and this air platform? And, you would think the Air Force would be the most against these, right? But it was an air mission. And so why is the Air Force leading in this charge for unmanned aerial, remotely piloted aircraft, essentially? And so that's the origins of the puzzle. Why these types of platforms? Why was the aircraft leading them? And then we became, after many years of writing this book, interested in what the implications would be for contemporary conflict today.
Okay, so as the kids say, TLDR, too long, didn't read. What's the key takeaways? What are the essential arguments that you'd like this audience to know about the book?
So this is, as you said, I think at the outset, a book masquerading as a book about military technology. It's not really about military technology per se, right? That's the case study. And this is about people, it's about identities, it's about beliefs that shape investments in different technologies. And so we focus on 3 different aspects in the book. The first is the role of identities, and that's service identities, and explaining why certain technologies were adopted over time and why not. So we look, for example, at the Navy identity, and argue, that the Navy has long time been quite an independent force, and it was focused on big platforms, and for identity reasons and also technological reasons, it wasn't so interested in unmanned technologies for a long time, but sort of the torpedo, which was very early on. We looked at the Army, which is focused on sort of soldiers being on the ground, and they dally with unmanned technologies that support ground troops, but that's really their main focus. And then you come to the Air Force, which is really an interesting character in the book. And Jackie is an Air Force vet, so we had some inside intel on this. And the Air Force comes across as being sort of the less secure service in some ways. It's the newer service out of the 3. And what we watch over time, and this is from World War II onwards, is the Air Force kind of co-opting missions and mission sets that it needs when it feels that they might be threatening to its identity. So you see this happening with ballistic missiles in the 1950s. You see it again in the 1990s with the unmanned aerial vehicles, right? And the Air Force see the Army interested in these technologies and then decide to take them as a result of that, and that's why it becomes an Air Force mission. The other 2 elements of the book that are really interesting are the role of beliefs, right? Individuals become really important in the story at certain junctures, and especially during wartime. So around the Gulf War, and especially around 9/11. And these individuals hold 2 different sets of beliefs. We argue one is around the role of technology in protecting US forces, so casualty aversion beliefs that grow out of Vietnam and are instilled in sort of a generation of officers. And you see the importance of that in, say, the 1990s, when it's reinforced through Bosnia, Kosovo, and experiences of the US military there. And that's the idea of using unmanned technology to substitute for pilots. And so that's how you end up with sort of predators and reapers. The second set of beliefs is around military revolutions, which really envisages a different role for unmanned technologies. It's more about integrating different types of unmanned technologies, whether that's sensors, satellites, unmanned, manned, and bringing it all together to create decisive, quick victories. And the best example of where that comes through is in the Gulf War in 1991. And this is born through Andy Marshall, for those of you who follow US military history and the Office of Net Assessment. So these beliefs anyway ebb and flow over time, and eventually what you see with 9/11 is the dominance of the casualty aversion belief shining through, the arming of the predator, and then investment in the predators and reapers, these big, exquisite, expensive platforms for about the next 15 years in American history.
So it's interesting, you mentioned the Predator and the Reaper, those very big, expensive drones and the strikes in Afghanistan and Iraq and so on. And I think people are familiar with those. For a lot of people, that's when they start to get this sense of uncrewed technologies. But one of the things that's really fascinating about the book is the way that you talk about this long history of unmanned technologies. And for every person who's heard of the Reaper, they probably haven't heard of the Kepler bug, which I hadn't heard of either. Can you talk a little bit about the evolution of these systems over time?
Yeah, and to be clear, in the book we take a really expansive definition of unmanned technologies. So it can be anything from really crude mines through to these exquisite, expensive platforms that fly like aircraft in the sky. And so if you take that expansive view, unmanned technologies, and we say unmanned, uncrewed, we spent so long writing the book that the terminology changed as we were writing it. But unmanned technologies have been around for a really long time. You have records of the Chinese using unmanned balloons as in military, as a military weapon. You have Da Vinci with a sketch of an aircraft, a pilotless aircraft in the 1500s. If you think of the Revolutionary War, Dave Bushnell sent kegs with firepower, off to frigates to the British. And then more recently, you have torpedoes, you have cruise missiles, you have ballistic missiles, precision-guided munitions in the 1990s through to the big predators and the reapers. So it's this evolution, and there's many different types of unmanned technologies over time, which is kind of what we're trying to explain in the book, right? Why do you end up on one course and not many of these others in terms of military investments?
Excuse me, you mentioned in those three different beliefs and intersections at the beginning, the idea of military revolutions. And I get the feeling that one of the things in the book that comes through is that you talk a lot about how this is actually, in some ways, this use of uncrewed technologies, as you said, is not new. It's been around for a long while, albeit that its sophistication has grown enormously in the last few decades. But I think one of the things, I also get the feeling in the book that you and Jackie feel that actually something qualitatively different is happening right now, and that Ukraine in some ways provides us with some clear lessons, some clear points of difference. I think in the book you say wars drive innovation. Can you just say, how does Ukraine and what we're seeing at the moment, the lessons that seem to be coming out of the battlefield month by month almost changes, how does that fit with this sort of longer arc of this evolutionary arc that you see with these technologies?
It's a great question. And I will say, we stopped writing this book and we sent it to publishers before the war in Ukraine. And so what we had to do was rewrite the final chapter about 3 times after that to try and keep up with developments on the ground. But you're right. So in the book, war is the ultimate arbiter, I think. You have experimentation with technologies in Vietnam, you have them again in the Gulf War, and then 9/11 as a fundamental critical juncture. But the war in Ukraine, 10 years ago, we had, if we're thinking back to the origins of this book, we had battlefields dominated, if we're thinking of unmanned technologies, by these reapers, these predators, cost anywhere from about $30 million to $150 million, depending on how you're counting the infrastructure around them. You're now looking at the battlefield in Ukraine, and quadcopters of a couple of $1,000s are dominating the tactics. And so, off-the-shelf commercial drones that can use satellite links, commercial satellite links, off-the-shoulder, one-way munitions, essentially. And so you have a much broader array of unmanned technologies, but at much cheaper rates. And so you got what I think Mike Horowitz, a US scholar, would call now you've gone to an era of cheap precision mass, where you can buy lots very cheaply and you still have quite a lot of precision because of the developments in satellite links and so forth. And so you have these, kamikaze drones, loitering munitions. There's an array of terminology that you can use for these. Carrying out different missions. They can be like munitions, they can be intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, they can be resupplying troops, but essentially they are transforming the battlefield in a way that the military revolutionists wouldn't have expected if they're thinking about the role of unmanned technologies. And I say that because they have brought, instead of taking human beings away from the battlefield, which was the goal really of a lot of unmanned technologies, actually they've made it close again, right? So you have people close up on the front lines controlling these quadcopters, these short-range drones, creating this tit-for-tat stalemate and war of attrition that is very far from the image of sort of the Gulf War, where you have this quick, quick, decisive, long-range theory of victory, essentially. And so you have this new transparency over the battlefield. Everyone can see what everyone else is doing. You have constant software updates and countermeasures put in place. You have, because of that, tanks can become vulnerable, so you're not using tanks anymore. I think Eric Schmidt's piece points to the use of motorcycles now by the Russians to try and get across no man's land, devolving into small groups of soldiers trying to avoid the drones, the use of fiber optic cables because of data link jamming. So a very different battlefield to the one that you might envisage 10 years ago with all of these high-tech revolutions.
That's it. I thought it was a really interesting point you make in the book, because one of the questions is what are the lessons that the US will take from the Ukraine experience, where you have the battlefield is not this space that's controlled over the horizon by the predators and the reapers, but actually it's back into this trench warfare, and that runs into these notions of the casualty aversion and also these service identities that you talk about. And I just wondered, how do you think that a huge institutional beast like the US military can absorb those lessons and overcome those embedded, those cultural and those ideas that you think are so important?
Yeah, I think it's a real challenge, and I think Jackie would say she's American, so I feel like I have to channel her in this. But I think it's a real challenge. And I was reading Eric Schmidt's piece. He was talking about Russia having the advantage of people, and basically, he would say sort of dispensable people that Russia will throw on the front lines. And the US culture is very different to that. The US military culture is very different to that. And they have this, as I said, this belief in sort of using these technologies to keep US forces sort of away from the front lines. And so there has been this huge push towards watching the Russia-Ukraine experience building unmanned technologies really fast, right? So they've got a replicated program that's designed to churn out quick, cheap drones to try and catch up with what's happening. The question is, how is that going to be integrated into US strategy in a way that makes sense for the US rather than replicating? It's not a copy and paste, I don't think, from the Russia-Ukraine experience. I think the US will try and incorporate those technologies to use them again to its advantage. So maybe embedding those technologies in the front lines of the army, for example, but in order to protect sort of forces further back. It will be integrated in a way that makes sense for the culture. And again, also in maybe the Indo-Pacific, where the campaign and the military's possibilities are very different than a continental war.
For those students who are here, the Eric Schmidt article that Julia mentioned is in Foreign Affairs just in the last week. He, of course, was the former CEO of Google, I guess. And is now heavily involved in some of these technologies in Ukraine. Julia, your book focuses a lot on the US, Obviously, that's where you were when you wrote it, for understandable reasons. But who else are the actors and states, but also, I suppose, non-state actors that are playing an increasing role with some of these technologies?
So China is obviously a key player, and the DJI company controls 70% of the commercial market. So China is obviously a key player, not only in the commercial realm, but also generating its own large suite of unmanned technologies. You have Israel and Turkey also as key exporters of military drones, the Harpy drone, Bacta drone from Turkey. And then, so those are sort of the key commercial and military players. The US still has great advantage in this sort of higher end military technologies, the higher end military drones as well. But you have just a broader, I think the experience of watching Ukraine and Russia has impacted everybody, right? And you have that interacting also with countries around the world facing increased strategic competition, concern about conflict, and for many also aging populations, retention issues with military forces, smaller youth populations to be training. And so you have an increased interest across the board in unmanned technologies. And you can see that when we go out to Asia, you see it in Singapore, you see it in South Korea. South Korea is also becoming a major player, and here in New Zealand as well.
Yeah, and in fact, Singapore was exercising some of its drones in the Tekapo training area in the South Island just earlier this year. You can't have a conversation like this without talking. We can't have a conversation about anything, it seems, these days, without talking about artificial intelligence. How does a lot of this is about increasingly sophisticated automated systems, but that are still driven by humans, and increasingly the integration of AI into these systems is obviously changing them. I mean, how do you moving towards that world of autonomy, and we'll come to that and where that potentially might go at its furthest extremes a little bit later. But how is that changing, for example, the way they're used? What do you see the implications of AI in this space?
I mean, I think, as you said, we're still in a world where it's largely, in terms of at least unmanned aircraft and drones, remotely piloted or semi-autonomous at best. We're not in a world of full autonomy. You can see the benefits of introducing increasing autonomy in the Ukraine and their recent Operation Spider's Web. They smuggled in, where the Ukraine smuggled in 117 drones into Russia, and once they were in Russia, out of line of sight, they were able to operate essentially autonomously to deliver sort of deep strikes into Russian territory, and it was quite a phenomenal feat, really, in terms of the secrecy around that and the ability to smuggle those drones across the border. But you can see the benefits of autonomy in that sort of situation and the introduction of autonomy there. But it's still subject to, these platforms are still subject to sort of countermeasures, right? They're still relying on data links. There's still a lot of jamming that takes place. This is why Russia has still gone back to sort of fiber optic cables to control a lot of their drones. And so it's still a little way off, I think. The way where you see the benefits of autonomy, I think, is around, or increasing AI use, is in the sort of the data gathering, the analysis, in sort of training and things like that. And it hasn't enabled nearly full autonomy yet.
Whenever new technologies are introduced, there's big questions about what they're going to do with the nature of warfare. Some technologies seen as advancing the offensive, some advantaging the defensive. What do you think these technologies will do to the nature of conflict?
Well, at the moment it's making attack much cheaper, right? So you can buy these quadcopters, you can buy these off-the-shelf technologies almost at a fraction of the cost that it is to bring them down. So air defenses are much more expensive. Missiles used for air defenses are much more expensive. And you saw that last year, I think, with the Iran-Israel attack as well, where I think Israel spent a lot more money trying to bring down the attack
Or the Red
missiles.
Sea with
Yeah,
Houthis as well.
yeah, it just costs many more millions of dollars. So the advantage is on the attack right now, at least in that theatre. Again, this sort of changes, I think, when you start looking at maritime domains. But you've heard Admiral Paparo in Indo-PACOM talking about the hellscape concept, which is massive investments also in the Indo-Pacific and the naval domain in unmanned technologies, with the idea, again, to sort of overwhelm an adversary and attack in order to buy time to bring in defences. So again, in an asymmetric warfare scenario, using unmanned technologies as a delaying tactic as well.
Yeah, I guess a conversation like this is always a what does this mean for us question. New Zealand issued a defence capability plan in early April that did talk a bit about uncrewed systems.
Yeah.
What kind of investment would you expect to see from New Zealand, and I mean, what things would you see more of, and especially thinking about these different domains that you talk about in the book?
Yeah, I think they've already signalled an interest in counter-UAS systems, so the ability to bring down unmanned aerial systems, but also maritime, interest in uncrewed surface vessels, so the ability to monitor, surveil the maritime domain, which makes sense for New Zealand. It's got a huge maritime exclusive economic zone, not many people, so it would make perfect sense to invest much more in uncrewed technologies in the maritime space. And then also an indication of an interest in longer range drones as well, on uncrewed aircraft. And so I think all of those are likely to happen. There was questions, I think, about whether those would be armed, which I think the answer was not now. But I imagine that there would be a purchase of UAVs that could, in theory, be armed if needed. Though I don't imagine that's on the cards right now.
Yeah, I think in terms of those surveillance technologies, I think New Zealand's bought or introduced a couple of blue bottles. Those
That's right. Blue bottles that come from Australia by customs and customs and NZIIA.
Yeah. And actually, I think one recently, just in the last few weeks, was actually up in Fiji, doing some work up there. So that's really an interesting development. And the other one is, I believe also there's some very interesting technologies for solar-powered, high-altitude aircraft that can sort of stay up for a long time and basically just broadcast pretty high-quality surveillance data. I don't think that's been introduced, but there are New Zealand companies that are producing these sorts of technologies. Okay, finally, and then we'll give people a chance to ask questions that you'd like to ask. I mean, I think with autonomy, we talked a lot about the sort of spectrum from automation to autonomy. And as these systems become increasingly autonomous, obviously that raises questions for sort of ethics and also around legalities, particularly as you're starting to move towards decisions where decisions over life and death are further removed from human decision making. New Zealand adopted a policy in November 2021, I think it was, to pursue an international legal instrument that would regulate lethal autonomous weapon systems. Civil society has been very active on this. But it feels like 2021 feels sort of like it feels like a long time ago already, and this feels like a much bleaker, darker world. I used to work on what we used to call the human security agenda, and it feels right now that that's kind of being unpicked and rolled back kind of issue by issue. But I just wondered if you had any thoughts about the regulation, the ethical issues. I know it's not one that you deal with deeply in the book.
We sidestep that one.
Yeah, but what do you think are you optimistic about the challenges for managing some of these technologies, or is the genie already out of the bottle?
I think, so I was tracking this when it was being discussed in the CCW, the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, falls off the tongue, and the debates around it, and a lot of the difficulty was around definitions of what meaningful human control meant of lethal autonomous weapon systems. And so sort of, obviously in international law, you want to be able to hold somebody responsible for an act of war or a crime. And how do you do that if a weapon is autonomous? So how do you maintain sort of meaningful human control? But then there was a breakdown in understanding, at least, or agreement on what that meant. Now I think there's been sort of a regeneration of interest in trying to establish a framework, I think probably spurred on by Russia, Ukraine, and seeing all the commercial technologies that are now so widely available. And it's moved into the UN General Assembly, which is more inclusive. So there may be some movement on that. I will say that when I looked at this previously, I looked at other preemptive bans that have taken place on sort of lethal weapons. And it's very hard to get countries to agree to a preemptive ban on a weapon where A, there is not clarity of definition, B, it's unclear what military effectiveness or advantage you're giving up, C, when there hasn't been a clear sort of catastrophe to motivate the international community to do something. And the only times that this has happened, landmines were banned, not preemptively, but were banned, but that was generally because the great powers saw them didn't have military effectiveness anymore. And with blinding lasers, just a random one, there was a preemptive ban, but that's because they could use, militaries of other powers said that they could use temporary blinding lasers instead of permanent blinding lasers, you know. So there's always reasons why those other bans have taken place, and I think it's just going to be very difficult to get a preemptive treaty on this.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty depressing at the moment when you think about those very crude, unmanned weapons like landmines, which for a long time were...
Which are now back.
And you see states withdraw from the Ottawa Treaty, so seeing military utility, let alone giving up a range of technologies that are much broader and harder to define. Okay, look, Julia, congratulations on a terrific book again. Let's open the floor to questions. And I think somebody's going to be looking at the online participants. So if you are joining us, where shall I look? If you are joining us online, please feel free to ask a question, concise, interesting, to the point, and we'll take them. But first up, down here, please.
So you said like how in Ukraine we've seen a move away from things like tanks that are a large investment that one cheap drone can blow up. Do you think that'll be even worse for Navy, or do you think that the ability to mount air defence on ships that can't be mounted on something like a tank will mean that Navy doesn't suffer in the same way?
Julia, can I just repeat the question for the people online, just in case they couldn't hear? So the question was that in Ukraine we've seen this sense of cheap semi-autonomous drones that really impose huge costs on armour, on tanks. Will we see the same kind of costs imposed in the naval domain? And or are there ways of responding? So sorry to repeat your question just so people can hear online.
You know, I think that's a great question. I think the Navy has realised that a lot of their big ships are now quite vulnerable, which for a long time there was resistance to sort of the uncrewed technologies and things like that, and focus on sort of building bigger aircraft carriers now was a real, well, I'm sure there's been a realisation for a while that these are very vulnerable platforms. I think the ability to mount air defence probably does make a difference, and I think a greater investment in uncrewed technologies to be on the offensive as well, and then they can be maybe stationed further back from combat zones. Makes it slightly different, but I think it's a great question.
So try and catch my eye if you have a question. I've got Suze at the back, and I'll cut you in a minute, so please.
Thanks, Julia and David. Great discussion. My question is around the role potentially of private operators, given we're moving away from the F-16s and the Apache helicopters now into mass production, much cheaper. Do you think you're going to start to see in grey zone that the emergence of sort of private fleets? I mean, you see the same in government in some way, the role of multinationals chomping into some of the roles that governments have formerly played. You know, and I think there's been a little bit of that in Ukraine, but what's your sense there of maybe the ebb boom of Defence Forces control over battle?
That's a great question, Suze, and I think, so you've seen elements of it in Ukraine. I do think that as commercial companies are growing in power, and they're certainly growing a lot of power in the military industrial complex, there's scope for that, or scope for partnering with other groups. So I think the role of non-state actors more broadly, not just private industry, but terrorist groups, for example, that we've seen, to use and adopt these technologies is going to be on the rise. When you first started asking the question, I thought you were talking about private industry more broadly in terms of power domestically. And I think if you're looking at the US system, you're seeing huge empowerment now of the domestic commercial base in a way that is quite unusual. In our book, we talk only really about government because it's really been top-down commissioning of technologies. And now we're getting a system that's much more open and bottom-up driven. And so I think that's also going to change the landscape quite a lot.
I think there was also quite a few bits of evidence about the adoption of some of these technologies by some of the drug cartels.
Yeah.
So there's no lack of enthusiasts for innovative technology. I'll come here and then I'll come here. So please.
Thank you. I was just wondering where you think the civilian costs of these technologies are going. There's been a lot of theorization around unrestricted warfare and with the advent of nuclear bombs and stuff that we're getting into more focused and targeted weapons. Certainly unmanned technologies in warfare, you're able to wage war more at a distance, but I'm wondering what is the actual civilian cost in this when the actual military is not there involved in the war?
So, well, I don't, do you want to have a go?
Well, I mean, it's your book. But I mean, I sort of think the point is, one of the points I took from reading it anyway was this, I mean, some of the advance of these technologies was initially envisaged as a way of sort of delivering a kind of more hygienic conflict, if there is such a thing, delivering precision munitions from a distance where you have your pilots and your own personnel are at less risk and you can target people in a kind of discrete, hygienic fashion. I think that what the lesson comes out of Ukraine is actually just that's certainly in those kind of theatres anyway, that's really not possible. And that, so the threats to civilians, I mean, what we've seen in films from Kyiv, for example, where you can now have low-cost glide bombs, forms of drones, and other forms of guided ammunition is significant civilian toll. So I'm not sure if that's answering your question, but...
Yeah, so when we talk about the belief in casualty aversion, force protection throughout the book, it's clear that when you get to sort of the 1980s and 90s and into the 2000s especially, that becomes not just about protection of US forces, it is also trying to mitigate civilian casualties more broadly. I'm not saying that was effective, I'm just saying that was sort of the motivating, one of the motivating beliefs in the investment in sort of these precision weapons and the use of sort of the Reapers and drones. And as David said, we've seen in Russia, Ukraine, sort of almost a reversal back to this trench warfare, this war of attrition that's much bloodier, much more costly. And so these technologies have not operated in quite the way that I think they expected them. But I'm not sure if that was your question.
If you could ask a follow-up question?
Sure.
What would you say then is the threshold between having unmanned precise systems versus weapons of mass destruction then?
Scale, I think, probably.
Okay.
Scale of the costs inflicted. And so if you're thinking of, biological or chemical weapons and the number of casualties inflicted in one weapon, or nuclear weapons, for example, those are sort of the categories usually of weapons of mass destruction, is the scale of cost.
Thanks, please.
Hi, thanks very much. I haven't seen a lot of hands, so if I can pose 2 questions. First, I suppose over the last sort of 3 decades or so, our systems have become very focused on generating acquisition for exquisite large systems over decades, or many of these systems. Noting that autonomous systems, and be it landmines, be it torpedoes or anything, they're just essentially a way of providing an effect for persistent or trivial. Have you seen in the research that was coming through in the book much adaptation in the, I know we've got accelerators and we've got the replicator programming, etc. But in the cultures of the organisations to adapt all the way through from government to military, noting that budget cycles, etc. need to change, to enable rapid development to support this. I mean, we're talking software changes within days. Some of those things would be quite difficult for our organisations to deal with without the imminent threat of invasion. The second part being, did you notice any, I suppose, cultural issues there where you investigated the different services in that focus on large exquisite platforms as opposed to the effects? So Navies have ships, they've had ships for hundreds of years. If you're a Navy, you have big ships. Armies fight. So once you start taking that away from the services, what does that mean? So did you find anything there about that from that perspective? Thanks.
In terms of the cultures shifting, whether there's evidence for them shifting, when we presented the book in the US, we had Mike Horowitz moderating, and he's just come out of the Pentagon, so we sort of wanted to ask him what was going on with the replicator program and everything. Were there people there that sort of understood basically what needed to happen? In the book, we identify the role of individual champions, individual leaders in spurring change, even when there is resistance within a culture, and so there's always individual, General Shriver in the 1950s. There's lots of examples of these individual change makers internal to the organisations. And his claim was that there are those people there now. So there are people who understand, whether it's, that's kind of how you get the change, is you have the champions internally. And he thought there was enough of that at senior levels that there would be it could work, that there would be a shift. And it may work in conjunction with, no matter what we think of Trump breaking the rules everywhere and, changing the way the acquisition programs and things and trying to cut down red tape and all of these other claims. But maybe in conjunction with that, there can be more rapid change than there has been in the past. In terms of the love for big platforms, that's what comes through for the Navy, for sure, and the sort of desire for the aircraft carriers, the ships. And it also comes through with the Air Force's love of planes as well. That's sort of the attachment to the fighter jet as well, and only bringing on other missions as needed to preserve the identity. The Army's a bit seems more flexible, at least in the book. It sort of is interested in bringing or using unmanned technologies to support ground operations, basically. And so you see it being more adaptable through the book to sort of tactical UAVs. It's just that they don't care, at least in the 1990s, the Air Force kind of took the mission, realising that the Army was interested. And so you do see the Army and both the Marines being a bit more flexible.
Fantastic. Thanks very much for those questions. Catch my eye if you've got a question, but we're going to take one from online now.
Do you have any thoughts on AUKUS or similar alliances and how that will support or pressure states to uptake uncrewed or autonomous technologies?
AUKUS is a David question. I can start.
Yeah.
I think so first of all, the DCP clearly identifies that, I was sidestepping AUKUS for a minute. The DCP clearly identifies interoperability with Australia as a key priority for New Zealand. So I think maintaining interoperability with partners, especially whether it's in manned or unmanned technologies, is going to be key. So I think there's an imperative not only for New Zealand's national interest in terms of its own sort of maritime security and other needs, but also to remain in step with partners to continue to invest in these technologies. Whether AUKUS plays a role in that or not, I see it as more of a need to keep in step with the partners that we already exercise with.
Yeah, I don't really have very much to add to that, except to say that I think in some of the early proof of concept AUKUS-related activities in Pillar 2, they have involved uncrewed technologies, autonomous technologies, drones, or some exercises in the UK. I think there was some of that was factored in as part of Talisman Sabre actually, with Japan, if I'm not mistaken, which was, there was a very good piece in Newsroom last week, talking about just that as one of the first sort of examples of a sort of autonomous system, but bringing in Japan as a pillar two participant for the first time. Marion.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Julia, for a fascinating talk. My question, in a way, is related to Sue's question about the possibility of non-government actors using these instruments. And I think that if you look at the Pacific right now, despite all the talk about geopolitical struggles, etc., the biggest issue that I see in the Pacific right now is actually transnational crime rather than battles going on. David, you mentioned drug dealers, and there was, I think, an unmanned boat of some sort with drugs on board was discovered relatively recently, and I think there was another one last year. So I guess just turning this around a bit, I mean, one can see some ways, and perhaps what the transnational criminal groups might use these things, but is there a role, do they have a role in policing for those of us who were involved in trying to, from the policing end of it, actually stop some of these things happening? Because, I mean, certainly the drugs, I think, is a real worry. Drugs in Samoa, drugs in Fiji, and pouring into the New Zealand market. Thank you.
The blue bottles, is that what
Yeah.
the blue bottles were designed to prevent they've seized some transnational crime attempts, I think, seized heroin already. So we've certainly seen unmanned or the uncrewed maritime vessels being used for TNOC.
Yeah, I mean, I just think the scale issue of the Pacific is one that's uniquely suited to autonomous surveillance technologies. So any of these, these platforms that can stay aloft for a long time, a whole range of different technologies that are monitoring vessels and collating, and also collating the information and sharing that. So,
Maritime domain awareness will be.
I saw Jim, I'll come to you in a second, Manju, but I saw Jim Rolfe shaking his head furiously as he is wont to do. But Jim, do you have a question or a response or a comment to that? In the back row there, please.
Thank you. This is to turn Marion's question on its head. In fact, has there ever been a time when technology has not transferred from the military to civil use, including criminal use? I think explosives and weapons and this goes on.
Nuclear weapons.
Thanks, Jim. Manju.
Thank you. I guess my question, in a way, is a follow-up to David's point about offense and defense. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on whether these uncrewed unmanned technologies enhance the propensity of a great power war, given that it's not just the US anymore that has access to these technologies. And like you mentioned, they favor, if that's the right word to use, attacks, so to speak. And I say this in particular because I remember back in the day, Obama was called George Bush on steroids because of his use of, drone attacks, which were not authorized by the US Congress. So just some thoughts on whether, are we on the threshold of a tech-driven stability paradox affecting the great powers? Thanks.
It's a great question. I mean, I think it can cut both ways, right? So in one sense, like the ubiquity of these drones and the uncrewed platforms everywhere means that we have much more intelligence, we have much more information, and that information can actually help stabilize because we at least don't have as much uncertainty if you think of it in terms of the information generation and the need to have sort of perfect information of what your adversary is doing. On the other hand, with all of these capabilities and the fact that they're so cheap, you also have the risk of miscalculation, misperception, and that can also be incredibly destabilizing. And so I think of it in the Indo-Pacific realm, and I don't know where I land on that, to be honest. I don't know whether it's more stabilizing to have greater awareness, to have more information, or whether more of these things, whatever they are, flying around means that we're going to risk rapid escalation or not.
Thank you. Please, there. Mark.
Thank you for that talk. I was thinking a lot during that discussion about Carol Cohn and sort of the sterilization of language. And it wasn't until sort of the blue bottles came up, right? You're talking about, oh, we had blue bottles in Fiji, right? That sounds a lot better than we have, unmanned surveillance vehicles. Obviously, we're seeing this creep in, where she was talking more about nuclear, now we're sort of talking about a different field. How do you kind of reconcile the sterilization of the language, which we saw in the time of nuclear weapons, where of course they weren't being used, with the sort of visual reality where we see those consequences, right? Because that sterilization was there to put a barrier between the practitioners who are talking about nuking millions of people, whereas we still see the sterilization of the language, but actually we're still seeing the use and the consequences of that. So, based to frame it in the context of your book, how does the Hand Behind Unmanned kind of view the fruits of their actions despite these very clear attempts to sort of sterilize that?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I assigned Carol Cohn in my nuclear politics class, so it's being thrown back at me. You're right, and we use the term precision-guided munitions, right? All of this to indicate less harm. And the opposite of that is happening in Ukraine right now. And so, I was thinking of that when I was writing some notes for this, the loyal wingman concept, where you have, stealth uncrewed aircraft as loyal wingman to bombers and other quite destructive platforms. So I don't know what that will mean for the language that we use, whether it reframes how we think about these technologies. But you're right in the sense that we still try and sterilize it, despite the fact that it's causing a lot of destruction.
Fantastic, great question. Thank you. Could you pass it to the person behind you?
Hi, just a quick question in regard to nuclear weapons. I mean, the US is a nuclear weapons state, has a large nuclear arsenal. Where do nuclear weapons fit into your analysis of the history of automated systems, autonomy in the US? Are they just regarded as another weapon, or are there some very clear kind of red lines around what the US is prepared to, how far the US is prepared to go down that road?
Yeah, it's interesting. We didn't include nuclear weapons in the book. We sort of categorized them as separate. And we talk about ballistic missiles, we talk about cruise missiles, but nuclear weapons kind of have their own separate trajectory as very distinctive, qualitatively different weapons that just are made intended not to be used. And so because we were trying to look at the use of unmanned technologies and the puzzle that we started with was the use of unmanned technologies, we kind of scoped them out of study for these reasons. Yeah.
I've got 3 or 4 questions piling up here. This gentleman here, please.
Yeah. Thank you, Julia and David, for the discussion. My first question was, what do you visualize the state of positional warfare be after this kind of technology-driven warfare? And I say that with the background of US retreat in Taliban, like despite having the technology, they could not dominate that area that much. So that was the first question regarding positional warfare and technology. And the second one is, can you comment on the future relationship between big tech companies and state orders or state governments in the global order? And analogy to draw would be like Meta's defiance of AI regulations given by the EU, so it has openly defined that. So do you see tech companies becoming so strong that they can defy governance?
On your first question, I mean, I think we're seeing sort of stalemate playing out in Russia, Ukraine. And it's clear that those technologies are not providing a decisive advantage to either side, right? I think what will matter in these kinds of wars is the size of industry and the ability of industry to support the building of drones, munitions, countermeasures, just constantly to be able to react in a sort of action-reaction cycle. So the moment we have it seems to be seems to be more stalemated, and the technology isn't providing decisive advantages either way. In terms of big tech, I think it sort of goes to Suze's question a little bit as well. I mean, they're certainly being empowered, right? I mean, I look at it in the US context and in sort of the invitation basically to compete for big programs now and to really be driving innovation in a way that used to be top down is now very much being driven bottom up and competition happening for all these big contracts. And so they're being empowered, whether that means they're going to be able to defy sort of whether that's state rules or international legal rules, I don't know, but it's certainly a trajectory where we're seeing the growth of domestic industry and the growth of these private companies certainly in the drone realm, the drone technologies.
Well, I think we're going to close off the question. We've got 2 or 3 still people in the room and one more online. I'll come to the online one first with you, Angus. And then I'll
Question from Rob Rebell. Are the implications of these technologies different for democracies than for other types of political regimes?
Is that the question? Full stop? Right. I mean, yes, if you think that public opinion matters for the voting box and people don't want to see their own sort of military forces being harmed on the battlefield, right? So if you're going by the casualty aversion thesis, which is that the loss of political will for battle comes from the public, and the public watches what happens on the battlefield, doesn't want their own citizens, their own family members harmed, then it puts constraints on what democracies can do in a way that authoritarian states don't have to answer to the public. So there may be differences there, and that was sort of my allusion with when I was alluding to Russia and the ability to sort of put more people on the front lines in a way that the US might not be able to.
So I think we'll take these last 2 questions together and let Julia respond to them. So this gentleman there in the back, and then I'll come to you in the front row, please.
Hi there. I think also I'm interested in the kind of interdependencies. For example, are there like quite complex supply chains, or is everything happening in like compartmentalized labs in individual states? And maybe also, is there an attempt to exclude certain other states from these supply chains? I think of the microchip deal and stuff that the US did to try to keep China out of that market.
Great, thank you. And we'll take a question from this gentleman at the front, and then we'll give Julia a chance to respond, and we'll conclude this gentleman, please.
Gosh, I've been reading 3 times, so to have such a magnificent audience, because I live alone, is wonderful. Julia, do we have time? I say that because when I was a child and Gary Powers was shot down in his U-2 over Moscow, I wrote about it at school and made a profit from it. So I've kept an eye on the journalism, media coverage of defence. But in the last few years, it's skyrocketed. Everybody's writing about it and publishing books. But it takes time. Today, New Zealand says we're going to order Skyhawks, Seahawks, and Airbus to replace the 757s. That's going to take time. We need people to operate. So there's no shortage of ideas. And I used to be confident as a child, right up until a few years ago, that the West would prevail. I no longer have that confidence. Do you, from your insights and contacts, do you have an assurance that the West is going to prevail?
Okay, no pressure, Julia. Good one to finish on. So some interesting questions there about those supply chains.
Yeah, the supply chain one is a really interesting question. I don't think I have actually a very good answer. I don't know a huge amount about the supply chains around drones. A lot are made indigenously to countries, but I'm sure there's some interesting routes there. And Israel and Turkey export a lot of their drones. So there's certainly transfers between countries. I don't know about the composite parts and how that comes together, but it'd be a really interesting study actually.
Well, thank you so much, Julia, for taking questions that have really traversed a pretty broad landscape of that touch on autonomy or on uncrewed weapon systems. It is a great book. It is available at all online megastores near you. But if you are, and actually for an academic book, it is actually very reasonably priced. And not only that, but we can provide you this evening with an online discount code, which will, what was it, £16?
Yeah.
£16. So what's that, about $32, $33, which I can tell you for an academic book these days is an absolute bargain. So it's a really interesting read. If you're still not up for a read, there is an 8-part podcast featuring our distinguished speaker, which you can find on all of your favourite podcast platforms, Spotify,
We're not just
Apple
reading the book out
Podcasts.
loud.
It's not just a read. It's a very engaging conversational podcast that actually I think
it has interviews with all the people that feature in the book.
and I think it also gives you a chance to talk to things that are more contemporary that
There's a
are
lot more on
evolving.
Ukraine. Yeah.
So have a look at that if you haven't followed it. But thanks so much for coming along. I'd invite you now to come through to the other room where, thanks to the Institute, we can have a glass of wine and perhaps you can carry on the conversation and ask Julia a question if you didn't get a chance. But before we do that, could I ask you to please join with me in thanking our special speaker.